The hospital lobby was alive with its usual chaos. Nurses rushed around, wheelchairs squeaked on the tiled floor, and the intercom buzzed with announcements. It was just another busy day until a small figure stepped through the sliding doors, catching everyone's attention. A young girl, no more than 12 years old, walked into the hospital. Her dark braids hung loose around her shoulders, and she carried something wrapped in a pale blanket. At first, no one noticed, but as she moved closer to the front desk, people began to turn their heads. The girl wasn't just carrying a bundle of blankets. Inside was a baby, a white baby. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but cautious. The girl nodded firmly. "This baby needs help. Please, he's sick." Her voice was steady, but her eyes told a different story, filled with worry and exhaustion. The receptionist hesitated, unsure of what to do. "Is this your little brother?" she asked, trying to make sense of the situation. The girl shook her head. "No, but he's been with me, and he's not okay. Please, help him." Before the receptionist could ask more questions, a nurse walked over, her sharp eyes quickly assessing the situation. The baby in the girl's arms was pale, his tiny face slack, and his breathing shallow. "We need to take him right now," the nurse said, her voice firm but kind. She reached out, and the girl reluctantly handed over the baby. "Take care of him," the girl whispered, her voice trembling just a little. The nurse nodded. "We will. Stay here for a moment, okay?" The girl stood by the desk as the nurse hurried off, the baby now cradled in her experienced hands. The lobby was quiet now, all eyes on the girl. Some people whispered to each other, their curiosity evident. What was this young girl doing with a baby that clearly wasn't hers? The receptionist tried again, her tone more gentle this time. "What's your name, sweetheart? And where are your parents?" The girl hesitated for a long moment. "My name is Amara," she finally said, avoiding the second question. "Okay, Amara," the receptionist continued, leaning closer. "Can you tell me how you know the baby?" Amara bit her lip, looking down at her worn sneakers. I found him. He needed me." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried enough weight to silence any further questions for now. Before the receptionist could ask anything else, a doctor appeared, his face serious. "We're stabilizing the baby, but he's in bad shape. We need to know what happened. Can someone get her story?" Amara straightened her shoulders, her small frame suddenly looking larger. "I'll tell you everything," she said. "Just make sure he's okay." The doctor nodded, his expression softening. "We'll do our best." As Amara sat down in a nearby chair, waiting to be called, the whispers around her grew louder. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who was this brave girl, and why was she here with a baby that didn't belong to her? Amara sat quietly in the waiting area, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. She kept her head down, avoiding the curious stares of the people around her. Her heart was pounding. All she could think about was the baby, how he needed help, and how she had done everything she could to keep him alive. The nurse who had taken the baby came back after a few minutes. She looked tired, but there was a soft smile on her face. "Amara, I'm Nurse Sarah," she said gently. "The baby's in stable condition for now. We're going to keep him here for a while, but he's going to be okay." Amara felt a small wave of relief wash over her, but she didn't smile. She was still worried. The baby had been so weak. What if something went wrong? "Can I see him?" Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nurse Sarah nodded. "We'll take you to him in a little while. But first, I need to ask you some questions, okay?" Amara hesitated. She knew what was coming. Questions about the baby, about who he was, where he came from, and most importantly, why she was the one carrying him. "I don't know who he is," Amara said quietly, looking up at the nurse. "I just found him." Nurse Sarah gave her a kind, understanding look. "Where did you find him, Amara?" Amara took a deep breath. She was scared to tell the truth. She had been on her own for so long, and she didn't want anyone to take the baby away from her. But the nurse's gentle eyes made her feel like she could trust her. "I found him in an alley, by the old supermarket," Amara said, her voice shaking slightly. "He was just there, crying. I couldn't leave him." The nurse's face softened. "And how long have you been taking care of him?" 3 days, Amara replied. "I fed him whatever I could find. I tried to keep him warm." Nurse Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. She was thinking. Then she looked at Amara again, this time with a little more urgency. "Amara, you're so brave, but you've been through a lot. You need help. Do you have anyone you can call? A family member?" Amara's chest tightened. She shook her head quickly. "No," she whispered. I don't have anyone." The nurse frowned but didn't push her. She could tell Amara was hiding something, but she also understood how scared the girl must have been. Instead, she changed the topic. "Amara, we'll take care of the baby, but we need to know if you need any help too. Are you hungry? Do you need a place to stay?" Amara shook her head again, not meeting the nurse's eyes. She didn't want to admit how hungry she was or how cold she felt. She had been staying in a small apartment with her grandmother, but even that had its challenges. "I'm okay," Amara said quietly, though it wasn't true. She wasn't okay. None of this was okay. Nurse Sarah gave her a concerned look. "I know you're doing your best, but please let us help you. We want to make sure you're safe too." Amara stayed silent. The thought of asking for help made her feel weak, but deep down, she knew she couldn't do this alone. As Nurse Sarah walked away, Amara watched her go. The baby was safe for now, but Amara had no idea what would happen next. The hospital was full of questions, and she wasn't sure how many answers she had left. The hours dragged by as Amara waited anxiously in the small room. She couldn't stop thinking about the baby, his pale face, his shallow breathing. She had done everything she could, but now it was out of her hands. Amara stood up and paced around the room, her mind racing. She was trying to stay calm, but fear kept creeping in. What if the baby didn't make it? What if she had done too little, too late? She remembered the moment she had found him, the helpless cries in the dark alley, the tiny, cold body curled up in a blanket. She couldn't just leave him there. She couldn't let him die alone. After what felt like forever, Nurse Sarah returned to the room. This time, she wasn't alone. A tall doctor with glasses stood beside her, looking over a clipboard. "Amara, this is Dr. Thompson," Nurse Sarah said with a smile. "He's one of our pediatric specialists. We've been looking after the baby, and he's stable for now, but we want to make sure he gets the best care." Dr. Thompson smiled at Amara, but his eyes were serious. "You did a good job getting him here, Amara," he said kindly. "He's been through a lot, but he's getting the care he needs." Amara nodded, but her worry didn't fade. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. The doctor exchanged a look with Nurse Sarah, then turned back to Amara. "He's weak, and he's dehydrated, but with the right treatment, he has a good chance of pulling through." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Amara, we're going to run some tests to make sure everything is okay. But he's in good hands now." Amara felt a small spark of hope, but it was quickly buried by doubt. She didn't know if the baby could survive this. He had been so close to death when she found him. "I don't know what happened to him," Amara said, almost to herself. "How did he get there? Who would leave him like that?" Dr. Thompson looked at her with understanding. "We're going to find out. We're doing everything we can to track down his family." He paused for a moment, and then added, "But Amara, we need to ask you some more questions. We're trying to figure out who this baby is." Amara felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't wanted to talk about this part. She didn't want anyone to know how she had found the baby alone, and how she had been the one to care for him all this time. She didn't want to admit how scared she had been. "I don't know who he is," Amara said again, her voice a little shakier this time. "I just found him. He was alone." Dr. Thompson nodded slowly. "We understand, Amara. But if you remember anything at all, it will help us." Amara took a deep breath. "I found him in an alley by the old supermarket. He was just there, crying. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't leave him. So I picked him up and brought him with me." The doctor listened carefully, writing down notes on his clipboard. "Thank you for telling us. We'll do our best to figure out where he came from and who he belongs to." Amara looked down at her hands, feeling a mix of relief and dread. She had done what she could, but now it was up to the doctors and the authorities to find out what happened to the baby and where he came from. For the first time in a while, Amara allowed herself to relax just a little. The baby was getting the help he needed, and that was all that mattered. As the hours passed, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing in ways she didn't fully understand. She had always kept to herself, always lived quietly, but now, with the baby at the hospital, things were starting to feel different. Nurse Sarah came back into the room. She smiled at Amara, but her face showed concern. "Amara, we need to talk a little more. It's important for us to understand your situation better." Amara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't want to talk about her life. She didn't want to explain how hard it had been or how lonely it sometimes felt. But she also knew that the nurse was trying to help. "Okay," Amara said softly, looking down at her hands. "What do you need to know?" Nurse Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "We just need to understand more about you, Amara. Where do you live? Who takes care of you?" Amara hesitated. She had grown used to taking care of herself. Her grandmother, who lived in the same small apartment as her, wasn't always able to help. But Amara didn't want to say too much. She didn't want anyone to take her away from the only family she had. "I live with my grandmother," Amara said quietly. "We don't have much, but we get by." Nurse Sarah nodded, taking notes. "I see. And how did you end up finding the baby, Amara? How did you know what to do?" Amara swallowed hard. She thought back to the alley where she had found the baby. It had been a cold, dark evening. She had been walking home from school, feeling tired and hungry, when she heard the cries. "I was walking by the old supermarket," Amara began, her voice soft. "It's always dark back there. I heard him crying and, I don't know, something just told me I couldn't leave him." Nurse Sarah waited for her to continue, sensing the weight of her words. Amara shook her head. "I didn't know what to do at first. I thought about running to get help, but then I just picked him up. I carried him home. I didn't think. I just did it." She paused, thinking back to those moments when she had felt so alone, but now, strangely, she didn't feel quite as alone. There was a sense of purpose in helping the baby, something that had been missing in her life for a long time. "You did something very brave, Amara," Nurse Sarah said softly. "I know it wasn't easy, but you made sure the baby was safe. That's what matters." Amara looked at her, unsure of what to say. She wasn't used to being praised, especially not for something that felt so natural to her. But in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was more capable than she had thought. As Nurse Sarah stood up to leave, she gave Amara a reassuring smile. "We'll take care of the baby. And remember, we're here to help you too. Don't be afraid to ask for anything you need, okay?" Amara nodded slowly, but she didn't feel ready to ask for anything. She didn't know what help looked like for her. She had always taken care of herself, always kept quiet. But as she sat alone in the room, thinking about the baby, she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. She just had to believe that things could be better. Amara sat in the small hospital room, her mind racing. She couldn't help but think about her grandmother. She had left her at home, alone, while she had come to the hospital with the baby. The thought of what her grandmother might say when she found out about the baby made her stomach turn. Her grandmother had always been strict, and though she loved her, there were times when it felt like she didn't understand Amara at all. Her grandmother often struggled to make ends meet, and Amara knew that bringing a baby into their small home would only make things harder. Nurse Sarah came back into the room, her smile gentle but serious. "Amara, we've been talking, and we think it's time to contact someone in your family. Do you have a way to reach your grandmother?" Amara hesitated. I didn't want to tell her. She's already worried about so much. I didn't want to make things worse. "I understand," Nurse Sarah said softly, "but you don't have to go through this alone. Your grandmother should know what's happening, and we can help her too." Amara nodded, her heart heavy. "I'll call her." The nurse handed her a hospital phone, and Amara took it with shaking hands. She dialed her grandmother's number, the phone ringing loudly in the quiet room. It felt like the longest ring of her life. Finally, the voice on the other end picked up. "Amara, what's going on? Why aren't you home yet?" Amara took a deep breath. "Grandma, I'm at the hospital." There was a long pause. "The hospital? What's wrong? Are you hurt?" Amara's voice cracked as she spoke. "No, Grandma. I'm fine. It's the baby. I found a baby, and he's really sick. I brought him here." Her grandmother's voice grew louder. "A baby? What do you mean, a baby? Where did you find him? What's happening, Amara?" Amara's heart raced. "I'll explain everything, Grandma, but you need to come here. I don't want to be alone right now." There was a sigh on the other end of the line. "I'll be there soon," her grandmother said, her voice softer now. "I'm coming. Don't worry." Amara hung up the phone and sank into the chair, her eyes closed for a moment. She felt both relieved and terrified. Her grandmother was coming, but how would she react when she found out what had happened? Would she be angry, disappointed, or would she understand? Amara's thoughts were interrupted when Nurse Sarah returned. "We'll get things ready for your grandmother," she said kindly. "We want to make sure she feels comfortable when she arrives." Amara nodded, but her mind was still spinning. She hadn't even thought about what to say to her grandmother. She hadn't thought about how this was going to change everything. A few minutes later, Amara's grandmother arrived at the hospital, her tired face looking worried. She walked quickly to the front desk, asking for Amara. When Nurse Sarah guided her to the room, Amara stood up nervously. Her grandmother's eyes locked onto her, and then they flicked to the crib beside the bed, where the baby was still resting. Amara's grandmother stepped forward, her voice shaking. What is this, Amara? What have you done?" Amara bit her lip. "I didn't know what else to do, Grandma. He needed help. I couldn't leave him." Her grandmother looked at the baby, then back at Amara, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, to Amara's surprise, her grandmother sighed deeply, her voice softer now. "You've always had a big heart, Amara, but I don't know what to do now. This is a lot." Amara held her breath, waiting for the anger that she had expected, but instead there was only worry. "I'll stay with you," her grandmother said quietly. "We'll figure this out together." Amara smiled, her chest feeling lighter. Maybe things were going to be okay after all. Amara sat in the small hospital room, her grandmother by her side, as the baby slept peacefully in a crib nearby. The quiet beeping of the machines was the only sound filling the space, but even that couldn't ease the tension in the air. Her grandmother was still trying to process everything, while Amara felt the weight of the situation hanging over her. As they sat together, the door to the room opened, and a tall officer stepped in. His uniform was neat, his expression serious but kind. "Hello, I'm Officer Daniels," he introduced himself. "I understand you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you both some important questions." Amara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She hadn't expected the police to be involved. She had hoped everything could be solved without them finding out. But now there they were. Her grandmother looked at Officer Daniels, her brow furrowed. "What does the police have to do with this? My granddaughter didn't do anything wrong. She just helped that baby." The officer nodded, his voice calm. "I understand, ma'am. We just need to get the full picture of what happened so we can figure out where the baby came from and what his situation is. Amara sat up straighter, trying to keep her emotions in check. I told Nurse Sarah everything. I found him in the alley. He was alone and crying. Officer Daniels nodded and turned to her grandmother. And you, ma'am, were unaware of the baby's presence. Her grandmother gave a slow nod. Yes. Amara didn't tell me anything until after she brought him here. The officer made a few notes on his notepad. Okay, I understand. We'll need to continue our investigation into the baby's background. But I want to reassure you both, this isn't about placing blame. We just need to ensure the baby's safety and get to the bottom of his situation. Amara's heart raced. She didn't know what was going to happen next. Was the baby going to be taken away? Was she in trouble for bringing him to the hospital? Amara, don't worry, her grandmother whispered, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. You did the right thing. We just need to tell them the truth. Amara nodded, feeling a little comforted by her grandmother's words. But still, the thought of losing the baby or being judged by the authorities left a heavy feeling in her chest. After a few moments, Officer Daniels stood up and nodded to both of them. We're going to start contacting the baby's family and run some checks to see if there's any missing person report. If you remember anything, even the smallest detail, please let us know. Amara's mind raced. What if the baby had a family that was looking for him? What if they were angry that she had taken him in? But the thought of leaving the baby alone again was unthinkable. I'll tell you everything I can, Amara said quietly, looking directly at Officer Daniels. I just want him to be okay. The officer gave a nod of understanding before leaving the room. Amara sat back down next to her grandmother, who gave her a soft smile. You did the right thing, Amara. That baby's lucky to have you. Her grandmother's words brought a sense of calm, but Amara still couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Would the authorities take the baby away? Would they find his real family? As Amara stared at the baby, now peacefully sleeping, she felt a mix of hope and uncertainty. She had done what she thought was best, but now it was out of her hands. She just had to wait and see what would happen next. The following days felt like a whirlwind. The hospital room, once quiet and calm, was now filled with activity. Nurses came in and out, checking on the baby's condition. Doctors continued their work to stabilize him, and the room felt smaller with every passing minute. But it wasn't just the hospital staff that filled the space. The news had spread quickly. What started as a quiet rescue in a local alley had turned into a story that was hard to ignore. Amara and her grandmother were no longer just worried about the baby's health. They were now part of a story the whole town was watching. News trucks lined the street outside the hospital, and reporters stood by, hoping to get a glimpse of the mysterious girl who had found the baby. Amara tried to ignore the reporters. She hated the attention. She didn't want to be famous or to have people asking questions. She just wanted the baby to be okay. But everywhere she went, people wanted to talk. At the hospital cafeteria, the nurses would look at her and smile, saying things like, "You're a hero." But Amara didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a normal girl who had just done what she thought was right. One afternoon, the local reporter named Sarah showed up at the hospital. She was polite, but there was a fire in her eyes. She had her camera crew with her, and they set up quietly outside the room. "Amara, can I talk to you for a moment?" Sarah asked as she walked into the room, her voice soft yet determined. Amara looked up, startled by the reporter's sudden appearance. She had been trying to avoid any questions, but it seemed like they were everywhere now. Her grandmother was sitting by the window, looking out at the busy street, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. "I'm not sure I have anything to say," Amara said quietly, feeling the weight of the reporter's gaze. Sarah smiled gently. "I understand, Amara, but people want to know more about you. They're inspired by what you did. They want to know how you found the baby and what you're feeling now." Amara's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't a hero, and she didn't want to make a big deal out of what she had done. "I just found him," she said softly. "I didn't think. I just knew I had to help him." The reporter nodded, her eyes warm. "That's exactly what people want to hear. You acted out of kindness, and that's something everyone can understand." Amara felt a little better hearing that, but it still made her uncomfortable. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She wanted the baby to get better. As Sarah continued to ask her questions, Amara answered as best she could, but her mind kept drifting back to the baby. Was he getting better? Was he still okay? Later that day, news outlets picked up the story, and it wasn't long before people started sending donations and offers of support. Messages flooded in, thanking Amara for her bravery. People from all over the community sent letters, gifts, and even food for her and her grandmother. Despite the attention, Amara's thoughts never strayed far from the baby. As much as the outside world seemed to focus on her, she only cared about one thing: making sure the baby was safe and cared for. Her grandmother, who had been quieter than usual, finally spoke up. "Amara," she said gently, "you did a good thing. I'm proud of you. But don't let all this change who you are. You did what you could. And that's enough." Amara smiled, feeling comforted by her grandmother's words. Maybe all this attention wasn't what she had wanted, but at least she had done the right thing. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. As the days went on, the baby grew stronger. Amara's heart swelled with hope every time she saw his tiny hands moving or heard him make the smallest sound. The world outside might have been chaotic, but in this small hospital room, things were slowly returning to a sense of normal. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Amara felt more hopeful. The baby, once so weak and frail, was now showing signs of improvement. His skin was gaining some color, his breathing steadier, and he even started to make little noises as he slept in the crib beside her. Amara spent every moment she could at the hospital, staying close to him, even when her grandmother urged her to take a break. It was hard for Amara to leave the baby alone for too long. She had made a promise to herself. She would see him through this, no matter what it took. Nurse Sarah checked in on the baby regularly, and with every visit, her smile grew wider. "He's responding really well to the treatment. His body's starting to gain strength," she told Amara one afternoon as she walked into the room. Amara nodded, a small but relieved smile on her face. "So he's going to be okay, right?" Nurse Sarah took a moment to look at the baby, then back at Amara. "We're not out of the woods yet, but he's made so much progress. He's a strong little guy." For the first time in weeks, Amara let out a deep breath she didn't know she was holding. That evening, as Amara sat by the window in the hospital room, looking out at the darkening sky, her grandmother came over and sat beside her. "Amara," her grandmother began, her voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened." Amara looked up at her, worried. "What do you mean?" Her grandmother smiled gently. "I've been thinking about how you didn't hesitate to help that baby. You didn't ask for anything in return. You just saw someone in need, and you did what was right. That's something a lot of people forget to do." Amara blushed, looking down. "I didn't think it was that big of a deal. I just saw him there, and I couldn't leave him." Her grandmother nodded, reaching over and patting Amara's hand. "But it is a big deal, Amara. You showed what it really means to care for someone. You showed the world that kindness matters." Amara's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't realized until now just how much her actions had affected others. She had simply acted out of instinct, out of love for the baby. But hearing her grandmother's words made her see the bigger picture. The door to the room opened, and Dr. Thompson stepped in, looking cheerful. "I got some good news, Amara. The baby is doing so well that we're going to start moving him to a regular room soon. He's almost out of danger." Amara's heart skipped a beat. She stood up, her face lighting up with joy. "Really? He's going to be okay?" Dr. Thompson smiled. "Yes, we're confident he'll continue to improve with time. He's a tough little fighter." Amara looked over at her grandmother, who was also smiling. "We did it, Grandma," Amara whispered, her voice full of emotion. Her grandmother reached out and hugged her. "No, sweetheart. You did it. You saved him." As the days passed, the baby continued to grow stronger. He had a long road ahead of him. But Amara knew that, together with her grandmother, they would do everything they could to make sure he was loved and cared for. The community's support had never stopped pouring in. People sent toys, clothes, and donations, all of them touched by Amara's selflessness. Some had even come to visit, wanting to thank her for her bravery. But through it all, Amara remained focused on what truly mattered: the baby. Amara knew that this wasn't the end of the journey. There would still be many challenges ahead, especially as they figured out what would happen to the baby in the future. But for now, she could breathe easy knowing that the most important part, keeping him alive, was a success. And with that, Amara felt a small but powerful sense of pride in her heart. She had done the right thing. And no matter what came next, she would always remember the feeling of knowing she had saved a life. Weeks had passed, and the baby, now stronger and more alert, was beginning to thrive. Amara sat by the crib, watching him closely, her heart full of warmth and pride. The little one had come so far, and she was grateful every day for the chance to be the one to care for him. It wasn't just the baby who had changed. Amara felt like a different person too. She had discovered a strength within herself that she never knew existed. The fear that had once gripped her was replaced by a deep sense of purpose. She knew now that she could face anything as long as she had the courage to do what was right. Her grandmother, too, had softened. Though she had been scared at first, she had come to realize that Amara's heart was full of love and kindness. She was proud of her granddaughter, and seeing the bond they shared with the baby made her feel hopeful for the future. One afternoon, Nurse Sarah came into the room with a small smile. "I've got some good news," she said, her eyes sparkling. "We've found the baby's family. His mother has been searching for him." Amara's heart raced. She had always wondered what would happen to the baby once he was well enough. Would he go back to his family? Would they be angry that she had cared for him? Nurse Sarah continued. "His mother was very worried. She didn't know where he was, and she's been looking everywhere. We've contacted her, and she's coming to the hospital tomorrow." Amara felt a rush of emotions. Part of her was relieved. This was the baby's family, the people he belonged to. But another part of her felt nervous. Would the mother be grateful for all that Amara had done? Or would she feel like Amara had taken something that wasn't hers? The next day, the baby's mother arrived at the hospital. She was a tall woman with dark hair, her eyes filled with worry. She walked into the room with a mix of fear and relief, her gaze immediately falling on the baby in the crib. Amara stood up, her hands trembling slightly. She had been preparing herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the feelings that rushed through her. "Are you the one who took care of him?" the woman asked softly, her voice shaking. Amara nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, I found him. He was alone, and I just couldn't leave him." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She stepped forward, looking at the baby. "Thank you. I don't know what to say. I've been looking everywhere. I never thought someone would save him like you did." Amara's heart swelled with emotion as the woman carefully picked up the baby. "I'm so grateful to you," she whispered, rocking the baby gently in her arms. The room was quiet for a moment as everyone watched. Amara's grandmother stood by her side, holding her hand tightly. She could see the love and gratitude in the woman's eyes, and it made her heart feel lighter. The baby's mother looked at Amara, a small smile on her face. "You're an incredible person, Amara. I will never forget what you did." Amara smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She hadn't expected this kind of response, but she was glad to see that the baby's family appreciated her help. She had done what she felt was right, and now she could see that it had all worked out. As the baby's mother continued to hold him, Amara realized that this wasn't the end. The baby would go back to his family. and Amara would go back to her life. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget this experience, and she would always carry the lessons she had learned. Her heart was full, and she knew that she had done something good.